Desmond Tutu is known as one of the most influential Christians in South Africa. His work was fundamental in abolishing apartheid, and he helped lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a radical attempt to bring together a divided country. Tutu became known worldwide for his work to stop apartheid and was even awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Stay tuned as we look at the life that led to Desmond's unwavering resolve to protect the unprotected and help heal a nation. Desmond Tutu was born October 7, 1931 in Klerksdorp, Transvaal, South Africa, to his mother Alan Dorothea Mavstak Madelhair and father Zachariah Zelio Tutu. The Tutus as a family were considered on the poorer side of society, although not fully destitute. It didn't help that Desmond was a sickly child, having to visit the hospital on multiple occasions. Nevertheless, Desmond was able to create deep relationships with his family. Tutu was initially baptized into the Methodist Church in June 1932, although the family changed denominations first to the African Methodist Episcopal Church and then ultimately settled with the Anglican Church. Desmond moved around often as a kid, going between his father's and mother's work, and eventually they settled down in Rudeport. At age 12, he underwent confirmation at St. Mary's Church and became very close with a priest named Trevor Huddleston. Huddleston would become one of the most influential individuals in Tutu's life at this time. As a result, Tutu developed within a relatively safe middle-class neighborhood with access to many different ways of making money and connections with wealthy white people. Everything was going well with Tutu until 1947, when he became hospitalized with tuberculosis. He spent 18 months in the hospital trying to recover. This long time spent in the hospital left Tutu with much time to grow his mind. He often met with Huddleston, his priest, being encouraged, challenged, and receiving hope from his visits. Another thing he had done while in the hospital was become circumcised, which he stated was a mark of entering manhood. After 18 months, he returned in 1949 and took his exams the following year in 1950, where he gained a second-class pass. Tutu had the chance to study medicine, although he could not afford the tuition. Looking elsewhere, he gained a government scholarship for teaching at Pretoria Bantu Normal College. Tutu was able to experience much of what the school had to offer, and one of his most notable situations was meeting Nelson Mandela, a significant individual he would meet back up with much later. In 1954, he received his Transvaal Bantu Teacher's Diploma and began teaching English at Matabane High School and then Klerksdorp High School the following year. It was around this time Tutu began courting Nomalizo Leah Shekzane. In June 1955, the two were legally married in Commissioner's Court, later having a Roman Catholic wedding ceremony at the Church of Mary Queen of Apostles at the request of his wife's Roman Catholic faith. They would go on to have a boy, Trevor, in April 1956, followed by 3 girls, Theresa, Naomi, and the youngest child, Mpho. Tutu spent much of this time worshiping at St. Paul's Church, where Tutu volunteered as a Sunday school teacher, assistant choir master, church counselor, lay preacher, and sub-deacon. Desmond and his wife's teaching careers ended when they refused to participate in the 1953 Bantu Education Act designed to promote the apartheid system and racial segregation. After becoming involved with the local congregation and leaving his teaching profession, he sought to become an Anglican priest. Although initially rejected because of his debts, a South African businessman named Harry Oppenheimer paid off all his debts. At this point, Tutu started his position at St. Peter's Theological College in Rosatenville. He lived alone here while his wife trained to become a nurse in Sekukenland. Nevertheless, he threw himself into his work and began forming many foundational beliefs that we will see rise in him throughout his life. In this educational atmosphere, Tutu first experienced the growing anti-apartheid activism by many Christians who viewed the system as against Christian values. At this time, though, Tutu had no strong opinions about the system, but sought to surround himself with apolitical colleagues or individuals not directly impacted by these systems. After his studies, he became ordained as an Anglican priest at St. Mary's Cathedral in December 1960. 2 years later, he was appointed assistant curate in St. Albans Parish, Benoni, where he made 2/3 of what his white counterparts made. 2 years later, he transferred to St. Philip's Church in Tekoza, where he developed a passion for pastoral ministry. At this time, his work was recognized, and Tutu was offered the ability to train as a theology teacher at King's College London to curate more black Africans in positions of ecclesiastical authority. Tutu learned from prominent theologians and developed meaningful relationships that continued opening his eyes to freedom of speech movements. While studying, his family stayed in the flats behind the church of St. Albans the Martyr in Golders Green. Tutu assisted Sunday services, with this being the first majority white congregation where he worked as a minister. The overall positive experience that Tutu had regarding the cooperation between Anglican, Catholic, and Methodist communities between blacks and whites developed a new framework for ministry and theology within his mind. Tutu officially graduated in September 1966, completing his dissertation on Islam in West Africa. His mindset had developed past bitterness toward whites and the feeling of racial inferiority, and he overcame his habit of automatically deferring to whites. The Tutu family arrived back in South Africa in 1967, settling in Alice, a small town in Eastern Cape. Desmond took up a teaching position at Federal Theological Seminary, aka FETSM, a multi-denominational Christian training school. While teaching at FETSM, he became the Anglican chaplain to the neighboring University of Fort Hare. Tutu most notably invited female and male students to be servers during the Eucharist, which was unusual at the time. With his position at Fort Hare, he became increasingly aware of the Black consciousness movement. After a sit-in, Tutu was appalled by the excessive power that the government used to suppress opposition. In 1970, Tutu left FETSM for another teaching position at the University of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland, UBLS, in Roma, Lesotho. This position brought him closer to his family and offered twice the pay of his previous post. Spending time in academia, Tutu had an ongoing relationship with the Theological Education Fund. In 1972, the TEF offered Tutu a position to become the Director of African Outreach. He would assess the grants to theological training institutes and students. As a result, Tutu began to travel around Africa, making new connections with many influential individuals involved in politics, ministry, and different social activist groups. Desmond found himself in a situation where he saw firsthand how the government abused its citizens and how the lack of connections that Black Africans had to a higher level. At this time, Tutu started to lean heavily into the Black and African theological movements. In 1973, he attended a conference at New York City's Union Theological Seminary. In this conference, he likely listened to James Cone, whom many call the father of Black theology. He was a professor at Union Theological Seminary at the time. He wrote 2 essential books in the early development of Black theology and Black Power, and A Black Liberation Theology. But for more information about James Cone and his influence on Black theology, you can click on the link at the top of the screen or in the description to watch the video we made looking at the life and work of James Cone. But back to Tutu's development. Being exposed to this liberation movement, Tutu began to see his role in his home state as vitally important to seek the liberation of his people. As Tutu integrated his newly developing theories about liberation theology, he was exposed to African liberation theology. These 2 closely related movements shared a lot. Still, within the context of apartheid, it seemed even more evident that true liberation would only come when the system of apartheid was over. Here in his life, we can see a shift in his preaching, leadership, ministry, and role in politics as he enters as a public figure against apartheid and becomes a beacon of hope for the oppressed people of South Africa. In 1975, there was a vacancy for the position of Bishop of Johannesburg. Tutu was nominated, but the job would go to Timothy Bevan, the former dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg. As Bavin took the position of bishop, he nominated Tutu to be his successor. The agreement was enough for both parties, and in March 1975, he became the new dean, making him the fourth highest individual in the Anglican hierarchy and the first black man to do so. He used his position to speak on the many social issues around him. For example, in Soweto, an uprising within 10 months found 660 black individuals under the age of 24 killed by the police. Tutu raised the question if the congregation would feel the same way if those kids killed looked like the predominantly white congregation. But the action that would bring the most attention to himself would be his first proclamation calling for an international economic boycott of South Africa over apartheid, calling on all countries to cease trade with South Africa until the uplift of the law of apartheid. Only 7 months after taking the position, Bavin stepped down, and Tutu was again nominated. In March of 1976, he was elected the new bishop of Lesotho. This change caused friction between Tutu and his congregation at St. Mary's, as many felt he had only been using the parish as a stepping stone to advance his career. Nevertheless, he took the position of the Bishop of Lesotho in August. He attempted to befriend the royal family, but this relationship was strained as the government was still very pro-apartheid. It was just 2 years later that the position of the General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches became vacant. After being rejected previously, the job was open again later in 1978 and Tutu was offered this new position. Tutu did end up accepting this position, but with this move, he angered many of the Anglican population of Lesotho, as many saw Tutu as simply jumping from position to position, trying only to increase his own standing. It was hard to argue, as in only 3 years, Tutu became Dean at St. Mary's, became Bishop of Lesotho, and then left to pursue another, more prestigious job. Although this left a sour taste in many people's mouths, the Tutu family moved on and took housing in the former residence in Johannesburg. This time, however, an anonymous foreign donor purchased their home for them. Tutu then took his place as leader of the SACC, where he began to make several changes, leading to the organization becoming one of South Africa's most valuable human rights advocacy organizations. This position called on Tutu to travel worldwide, where he would give speeches, make connections, and, most importantly, fundraise for the organization. In this position, Desmond shined as a leader and a mouthpiece for the oppressed of South Africa. Also, during this time, Tutu took on the role of the rector of St. Augustine's Church in Soweto's Orlando West. This position once again gave him the platform to speak about the relations of apartheid and justice, and he would publish several collections of sermons and speeches about this exact topic. As the 80s started moving along, Tutu positioned himself as one of the foremost leaders of the anti-apartheid movement. Although he petitioned for the release of leaders of the ANC, especially the activist Nelson Mandela, who he had built a relationship with, he, for the most part, kept his opinions and actions outside of any sole political movement. He preached very heavily against the violence that many activists used against the government, but at the same time called for an international economic boycott of South Africa. He often angered much of the white minority, but also came under criticism from many African activists for not acting as strongly against the government in many situations. This placement as a mouthpiece of South Africa would garner the attention of a group of people looking for an opportunity to help champion the cause of the anti-apartheid movement without having to connect themselves with an activist group. This group would nominate and officially bestow the coveted Nobel Peace Prize on Desmond Tutu in 1984. He was recognized for his ongoing efforts in South Africa. He was actually on a 3-month sabbatical in the United States when it was announced, but soon after returned, where he shared his winnings with his family, the SACC staff, and he funded a scholarship for South Africans in exile. Many championed him as a leader for liberation, but the news inside of the South African government mostly ignored or downplayed his achievement. Later, in 1985, Tutu was elected as the 6th Bishop of Johannesburg by a Bishop's Synod. Tutu was now over the country's largest diocese, comprising 102 parishes and 300,000 parishioners, about 80% of whom were black. He left no time as he immediately began speaking about international sanctions, the dismantling of apartheid, and the violence against black Africans. He still, however, was preaching a non-violent approach to this matter, which caused many frustrations with the ANC, who were actively calling for violent measures to change the landscape. But with many of the anti-apartheid leaders in jail, Mandela referred to Tutu as public enemy number one for the powers that be. Only a year later, Philip Russell announced his retirement as the Archbishop of Cape Town in February 1986. As they tried to find his replacement, Tutu's name quickly became a frontrunner. Not too long after, he secured a 2/3 majority from both clergy and laity, and he was also unanimously voted in by the Synod of Bishops. It was another quick change in Desmond's ministry, but he was now the first black man ever to hold the Archbishop of Cape Town's position. He moved into the Archbishop's residence, which was technically illegal since the home was in a white-only area. He began making moves as he ordained female priests, appointed gay priests to senior positions, and continued to speak against the apartheid government from the pulpit. Tutu finally landed in one of the highest positions in the Anglican ministry. He continued to speak over his followers, helped to guide them in their lives, while also touring around the world, speaking about the oppression in South Africa. Things began to change in 1990 when de Klerk lifted the ban on political parties like the ANC. He then announced Nelson Mandela's release from prison. After this, Mandela and his wife stayed at the home of Tutu on his first night of freedom. As the landscape began to change, Tutu doubled down on the call for non-violence and even banned Anglican clergy from belonging to political parties. 4 years later, in April of 1994, the first multi-general election took place. The ANC won the election and Mandela was declared president. This action caused a complete 180 in the power dynamic. Tutu was one of the individuals that helped look over the new developing landscape. However, he continued to ride the level of moderate as he continued to be independent from the ANC government. He even called them out on multiple occasions for doing the things they had once preached against by the previous government. Nevertheless, Tutu found himself as one of South Africa's vocal leaders and was looked to time and time again to get his opinion on the way things were progressing. As things began to change within the governmental leadership of South Africa, Tutu also felt his time as Archbishop was coming to completion. At this point, he was at the highest level he had ever been, and any more movement he wished to make would not fit with the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. With this accumulating, Tutu officially announced he was retiring in 1996. Although many in the Anglican movement were upset, they held Tutu's leadership as extremely important during the very difficult times of his South African Anglican ministry. One of the levels of appreciation he was shown was when the other bishops bestowed him the term Archbishop Emeritus, meaning having retired but being allowed to retain their title as an honor. A farewell ceremony was held in June 1996 at St. George's Cathedral. The final award he would receive at this time was from the then President Nelson Mandela, who awarded Tutu the Order for Meritorious Service. However, this connection to Mandela would not end here. It would be the same year he stepped down from ministry that he would again be thrust into the spotlight, this time on behalf of the government. Tutu would quickly be thrust into one of his most important positions. In 1995, Parliament established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This was a radical approach to what to do with all the injustices that occurred within the apartheid government. This question had been ruminating since the very beginning of the anti-apartheid movement. There wasn't an easy answer. Some wanted to adopt a style like the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials were sentenced to heavy sentences for the atrocities committed during World War II. Others believed the white minority needed to be exiled from the country or be given severe limitations like black Africans had been dealing with under apartheid. But there was another sentiment that Tutu often talked about. It was the fear that once the white minority was overthrown, the new governmental structures would continue the cycle of oppression, but this time with someone else as the oppressed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions would be the official answer to what to do now that the oppressed had finally overthrown the oppressor. To the shock of many, the TRC would roll out a radical approach to reconciliation. Complete forgiveness and total immunity could be granted if those who committed human rights abuses agreed to stand before the committee and admit to the complete truth of their actions. If they were found to have confessed to the fullness of their crimes, they would be granted total freedom from persecution, although they might also be told to do something in the form of reparations. To show that this commission was committed to fully reconciling the country moving forward, they would also open this up to any ANC or any black activist who had committed violent crimes in protest to the government. But the fact that the commission was offering a radical approach to reconcile the oppressed with the former oppressor, it would still receive much pushback and skepticism by both sides. On the one side, white news reporters and former governmental leaders claimed that this was simply a trap to get everyone to admit to their crimes so that the new government could prosecute everyone fully with their crimes on record. Many news agencies pushed this narrative to combat the TRC by filming interviews with the former white leaders accused of numerous human rights violations as they painted a false narrative of the trial. But it wasn't just the former white oppressors that pushed back. Many Africans found it appalling that the government would look over all of the harm that these people had brought to individual families and communities. They believed the TRC sought to pave a new road on top of all the people who lost their lives being killed during apartheid. They thought offering freedom to the former oppressors was like spitting in the face of every black boy who was tortured and killed simply for being black. Although there may have been harsh criticisms and many were skeptical, the government doubled down on their idea to progress with the TRC. And one of the primary reasons was that they had Desmond Tutu as the head of the organization. Tutu had over 300 staff total. He had 16 other commissioners who would preside over the meetings, and the weight of the entire apartheid movement hung over the organization. It was a battle from the very beginning. Before they even made it to trials, Tutu had to deal with the interpersonal differences of the committee. The first is that Tutu himself was a proud Christian who often opened meetings with prayer. But within the leadership there were people from different ethnic and religious backgrounds that caused Tutu much stress as he sought to create an equal platform for all administration. Although the commission was a completely secular organization, with many in the organization being non-religious, there was no denying that this radical approach was not simply based upon religious rules. Tutu, Mandela, and many other leaders referred to the traditional African jurisprudence, quote, in the spirit of Ubuntu, as one of the driving reasons behind the movement. However, Tutu summarized it officially as restorative justice. But there would be too many people and procedures for commissioners to participate in the program from start to finish. Because of this, Tutu broke the commission into 3 organizations: confession, forgiveness, and restitution. Tutu would preside over the confessional committee, which would hear each person's crimes. Tutu was a natural choice, as his presence would show that this played a vital role in the reconciliation process. Tutu believed in this commission wholeheartedly. He once said, quote, "True reconciliation exposes the awfulness, the abuse, the pain, the hurt, the truth. It could even make things worse. It is a risky undertaking. But in the end, it is worthwhile because, in the end, only an honest confrontation with reality can bring real healing." End quote. This commission was not a cheerful event, nor was it mundane in its importance. Often, the room would be filled with tears as loved ones finally found out what happened to their loved ones. Tears came as statements were read of senseless violence, torture, and the blatant lack of care for the well-being of a portion of society simply because of their skin color. Day after day, individuals brought forth gut-wrenching stories that boiled the blood of those in the crowd and broke their hearts. But Tutu believed this was the only authentic way forward. He said, quote, "Telling their stories did mean you were running the risk of opening wounds, but In fact, often they were wounds that had been festering, and to open them now in this fashion had the chance of cleansing them and pouring a balm and ointment on them." End quote. The most important thing for Tutu was to heal the wound. He fully believed that any unconfessed guilt left over would eat at those who were guilty and cause those victimized to continue in the act of unforgiveness. If this whole commission was to work, the first step must be done completely and thoroughly. The TRC went on for 18 months, with the first trial in April of 1996 and the final recordings being put together in 5 volumes in October 1998. Tutu presided over the entire process, although he did not often intervene in the committees that granted amnesty. He felt that the group doing it was better qualified than him to pass the sentence. The committee would unearth a wide variety of activities perpetrated by the apartheid government, vigilante violence, and even some of the ANC members who were revealed to have engaged in torture, attacks on civilians, and other human rights abuses themselves. The last point led to confrontation between Tutu and Mandela, where the ANC sought to suppress part of the final report to lessen the ANC's confessions. This infuriated Tutu, who argued that it went in the face of the whole commission and that it was a slippery slope that would lead to yesterday's oppressed quite easily becoming today's oppressors. Mandela agreed with Tutu, and in October 1998, Tutu presented Mandela with the full 5-volume report from the TRC in a public ceremony in Pretoria. The overall impact is so much more significant than any way of measuring could ever encapsulate. There was, of course, criticism thrown at the meeting, but as a start to a new change in South African government, it was marked as a successful transition. Tutu himself was relatively pleased with the whole process and all the TRC achieved. He would recognize the inevitable shortcomings of the procedures, but emphasized that for the long-term reconciliation, it would ultimately be seen as a success. After the TRC, Tutu became a household name not only in South Africa, but for many around the world. He was asked to teach classes at several universities in the United States and back home. At this point, he was fully connected with the Black theology movement, and many of his teaching and speaking positions would be connected to this theological basis. As he continued to speak, he began to develop a position on many different social issues concerning homosexuality, women's rights, discrimination in various forms. Regarding the description against homosexuality, he was quoted as saying, "If God, as they say, is homophobic, I wouldn't worship that God." End quote. However, Tutu held on to his Anglican theology for his whole life, as he stated multiple times that it is tolerant and open to reason in its true sense. And he always focused on the inclusivity presented in the church. Tutu would have his name cited worldwide for years as a religious leader, but in 2010 he announced his retirement from public life to spend more time with family, reading, writing, and thinking. This wouldn't mean that the world would not hear from him. He continued to publish opinions about the state of theology and the state of the world in general. In 2013, he removed his support from the ANC, declaring he would not vote for them again because they had done a poor job countering inequality, violence, and corruption. In 2014, he voiced his support of legalized assisted dying, going as far to say that if he wanted to choose that option, he should be able to take it. In 2015, he blessed his daughter Poe's marriage to another woman in the Netherlands. Tutu's days would eventually end on December 26, 2021, at the Oasis Frail Care Center in Cape Town, South Africa. South African President Cyril described Tutu's death as, quote, "another chapter of bereavement in our nation's farewell to a generation of outstanding South Africans who had bequeathed us a liberated South Africa," end quote. There was a national mourning taking place for several days. Then, a funeral mass was held at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town on January 1st, 2022. Tutu's body lay in a plain pine coffin, which was the cheapest available coffin, which was the request of Tutu to avoid ostentatious displays. Unfortunately, the funeral was limited to 100 people as the world was still battling COVID-19. Following the funeral, Tutu's remains underwent aquamation, a process similar to cremation but using water, one of the most eco-friendly ways of turning a body into ashes. His ashes are interred in St. George's Cathedral. Desmond Tutu became respected worldwide for his uncompromising stand for justice and reconciliation. His approach to the apartheid government offered him a unique opportunity to call for change openly in public without the harsh punishment that many other anti-apartheid activists had to deal with. His church and ministry-focused nonviolence led many to equate his work with Martin Luther King Jr. Both helped rally a whole country to see the injustices blacks were facing under an unfair governmental structure. He ultimately got to be hands-on in the process as he helped lead the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which helped bring in an era of reconciliation between once-hated individuals and enemies. His legacy after the TRC, and as he left his role as Archbishop, was a voice for the LGBTQ movement and many progressive social movements like assisted suicide. Ultimately, his legacy will be shaped by a radical move to spend his life fighting against all forms of oppression and hate from a Christ-centered perspective. As one scholar put it, Tutu was, quote, the personification of the South African freedom struggle. But that is all for now. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, hit the like and subscribe button below. While you're down there, let me know what you think about Desmond Tutu and who you would like to see in the future. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time with another informative and accessible introduction.